Hello and welcome back to History for Atheists. As some of you may already be aware, over the next few months I will be beginning to wind down the History for Atheists project. After 10 years of regular articles and book reviews and 5 years of videos and podcast episodes, I feel I've covered most of the main myths and bad historical ideas perpetuated by some of my fellow atheists. So I'll be stepping back from this project to focus on some other activities. These will likely still be history-oriented and focused on debunking bad history, so stay tuned to my social media for more in coming months. This doesn't mean I will not be posting to the History for Atheists site at all. I imagine I'll still post the occasional book review and perhaps debunking of any particularly egregious example of atheist bad history, but it does mean I won't be maintaining my usual more or less monthly posting schedule. It also means that I'll be winding up this video channel and its attendant podcast episodes, which means my guest today is likely to be the last interviewee on History for Atheists. So I thought I'd go out with a bang. My very special guest today is Professor Bart Ehrman. Bart will need no introduction for most people watching this, but in case you aren't aware, he's the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the author of over 30 books on early Christianity and New Testament studies, including bestsellers like Misquoting Jesus and Jesus Interrupted. These and other books have made him the bête noire of Christian fundamentalists, but his book Did Jesus Exist also made him deeply unpopular, predictably, with Jesus Mythicists, since he holds that fringe idea in very low regard. So today, thanks to generous donations from people I'll thank by name at the end of this interview, I have the great pleasure of discussing Jesus Mythicism with Dr. Bart Ehrman. We cover a lot of ground in just 1 hour, and I'm sure some of what he says is going to set the cat amongst certain pigeons. So please enjoy my conversation with Professor Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, you are very welcome to History for Atheists. Thank you very much for giving up your time and coming on the channel.
Well, I'm very glad to be here.
Now, we don't have a lot of time, so what I want to do is kind of jump straight in. We're going to be talking about Jesus Mythicism, and I think most of my viewers are pretty familiar with this topic, and we don't really kind of need to go through the basics. What I want to do, though, is maybe play devil's advocate a little bit and put maybe some slightly more curly questions to you, perhaps. Some questions that mythicists claim you don't answer properly, so here's your chance.
Okay.
I think maybe the first one, I should also say congratulations on your upcoming retirement from teaching after a great and illustrious career.
Thanks. Just, think of all these additional podcasts I can do now.
Very true. Look, I thought the first one that I wanted to go through is the idea of whether we have independent sources for for Jesus at all, and therefore whether we can use those to answer the question regarding whether or not he existed. So you make the point that the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and Thomas have some degree of independence as sources. And I think most people would be aware that there's interdependence textually between at least some of those.
Yeah.
But you argue that there's enough independence between those sources that we can regard them as, to a certain extent, as independent of each other. The mythicists counter that by saying, or respond to that by saying, you don't have any evidence for that. They say that actually there's nothing to preclude the idea that all of those other Gospels derive from Mark. So that there was this idea, there was a celestial Jesus that got historicized. Mark wrote these stories about a Jesus on earth, even though there hadn't been a previous belief in Jesus on earth. And then those other Gospels are riffs on the Gospel of Mark, so that you're wrong, and you also have no evidence. They refer to what they call the Ehrman circle. Don't know if you're familiar with this.
No.
This is where you assume something that assumes that, or assume that Jesus existed, make an argument based on that assumption, and then arrive at the conclusion from that argument that Jesus existed. So they claim that your argument in relation to these Gospels' independence is an example of the Ehrman circle. So I'm putting you on the spot.
No, you're not at all. No, look, you have to look at every possibility. If you're being a serious historian, you look at every option and you figure out which ones have the evidence and which ones don't. May I ask, when they say that I have no evidence, they mean that Mark wrote, and that when John copied Mark somehow, the stuff that he didn't copy from Mark is just stuff he was making up? Is that it?
Yeah, that seems to be the argument. In fact, that's very much the argument. They claim that your argument is they couldn't possibly have made all that stuff up.
Okay, no, that's not my argument. No, that's not my argument. But let me ask this: do they have evidence that John made it all up? In other words, they have an argument? If they're saying that I'm assuming, that what evidence do they have that John was inventing everything else as opposed to having a source?
The arguments that they tend to make, and obviously I can't be comprehensive here, but I'll do my best to steelman what they say. The arguments they tend to make is that we know that at least some of the stuff in those other Gospels is likely to have been created by the authors.
Okay, what's their evidence of that?
Yes, very good question, but there's no
evidence of that.
Okay.
How do you know? How would you possibly know that somebody 2,000 years ago was either copying a source or making it up in his head? So how would you? What evidence would you have that he's making it up? We do have evidence that they're copying sources, and so it's wrong to say I don't have evidence for that, because when they say that Thomas is dependent on Mark, for example, or when they say it's dependent on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're saying he had written sources. And if John is dependent on Mark, they're saying he has a written source. And if Luke used Matthew and Mark, then he had written sources. Luke tells us he had written sources. So I wouldn't say that it's just an assumption on my part. I'd say the default position is the one that we actually have evidence for, which is that they use sources. So if somebody wants to say that, they used Mark and made everything up, there is hardly anything in Mark that's in John. There are some stories that are similar, but they're not told in the same words. They're not the same story. It's really hard to make a case that John's based principally on Mark. What evidence is there for that?
Well, okay. Again, I'm going to play devil's advocate, but let's take the Jesus' return to Nazareth in the synoptics. In Mark, it's a fairly bald story. He goes back to Nazareth. People are skeptical about him. He can't do any major miracles. In Luke, there's a much more additional element to the narrative. He picks up the Isaiah scroll, he reads from it, he declares himself to be the fulfillment of that prophecy. You would say that is not the author of Luke adding a narrative element, in other words, making it up?
Oh, I don't know. About that story. That story, that's a very important story. Luke has clearly changed what's going on. For one thing, he's made it the very first thing that Jesus does in his ministry, as opposed to Mark, where it's right smack in the middle. It's actually toward the end of his ministry. And Luke appears to have done that because it shows so well his overarching theme in both Luke and Acts, that Jesus was to be rejected by the Jews so that the message can go to the Gentiles. So if you read that story carefully, that's what it's about. So did Luke invent that part of it? He may have. Yeah. That has nothing to do with whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are entirely made up, because everybody admits they made up some things. Yes.
Yeah.
But so I suppose there's no evidence that they use sources. What?
So I suppose the argument that they're making is that if we agree that they made up some things, then why couldn't they have made up all of the stuff?
Okay. Let's say they could have. Okay. Let's say they could have. What's the evidence?
Yeah.
So I don't think they should accuse me of not having evidence, because I have solid evidence that they used sources.
Yeah.
And I want to know what evidence they have that everything was made up. So I'm just turning their argument against me I'm saying, I think it's wrong about me, because we have evidence that they have sources. But where's the evidence that everything else is made up in their own heads?
Yeah. I suppose another argument that they make is that anyone who was at this level of literacy in Greek, or in other words, was able to compose in Greek, had learned to do that through an educational system that encouraged people to take stories and to basically riff on them, to write extrapolated versions of them, and that this is what the gospel writers are doing. How would you respond to that?
I think that was part of the educational system, but it wasn't the entire educational system. I don't know how well read they are in educational systems in antiquity. The world expert is Raphael Cribiori, who's written a number of very important books about it. And that is indeed something that people learned when they got advanced rhetorical education. But, we also have historians who are trained in Greek writing, and they're not, that's not how they're working at all. I mean, read Plutarch. Read Suetonius, read Livy. That's not what they're doing. And so I don't know how familiar they are with these other authors, but I mean, there's certainly authors who are recording things that happened in the past that aren't just making stuff up.
So could we, I'm still playing devil's advocate, could we say that it's at least possible that Mark is basically the core and everyone else is basically riffing on Mark? I mean, it's at least possible, yeah?
Well, I don't know what would make it impossible. No, I don't think anybody says it's impossible.
Sure. Okay. You would say.
But history is not a matter of deciding if history is a matter of establishing probabilities.
Sure. Yeah.
And so for a probability to be a probability, of course, it first has to be a possibility. But the fact that something is possible doesn't make it probable. And so to decide what's probable, you have to look for evidence. You can't just say, well, the other person has no evidence, so I'm right.
And this is something I find mythicists do a hell of a lot. They come up with something as a possibility, decide that they like that possibility because it helps them reach the conclusion they want, and then argue ferociously that that's the only possible possibility. Yeah. But back to you obviously believe that it is far more likely that there were independent sources other than Mark. And
I think there's good evidence for it. There's really good evidence for it because, I mean, Matthew and Luke, for example, have a number of passages that are in common that are not in Mark. So how do they have word-for-word agreements in passages that are not in Mark unless they have the same sources? You can't have word-for-word agreements. If two people are making up a story, suppose somebody makes up a story about you, suppose you got two people make up a story about you, and it turns out they've got entire paragraphs of the same, and they haven't consulted with each other. How's that work? Word for word the same. It doesn't. You can't do it. And so this is not like a debated issue. Of course they had sources. How else are they going to have word for word agreements?
So that's the Q material, but of course mythicists go with those non-mythicist scholars who believe that there wasn't Q and have other arguments for how there is that commonality.
The argument is that Luke used Matthew.
Yeah,
that means it's another source. It has to be a written source because they're word for word the same.
Okay, but if Matthew was just riffing from Mark, doesn't that still sustain their argument?
No, because Luke then has two sources, written sources. I'm not saying that that's the way it is because I don't think it is the way, but I'm saying they are admitting that Luke used two sources. So why do they say then Luke made everything up?
And Luke talks about how there have been multiple accounts and that he's trying to pull them all together. So
and he's trying to write an accurate account. He doesn't think his predecessors are good, which is kind of telling because Mark was one of his predecessors, and it seems like he doesn't think Mark was accurate. But
they also argue that Goodacre has proven definitively, that's their word, that Thomas is derived from the Synoptics. How would you respond to that?
Well, he hasn't proven it definitively because some of us don't buy it, but he certainly has the best arguments one could make for it. But when Mark Goodacre shows that, he is not saying that Thomas's only source were the Synoptics. Half of the sayings, so the Gospel of Thomas has 114 sayings. About half of them you can find, especially in Matthew and Luke. Half of them are completely unlike anything in Matthew and Luke, or Mark, or John. And so he didn't get them from the Synoptics. So when we talk about a source being dependent, I think people get it confused because they think that if one source is dependent on another, that scholars are saying that's the only source they had. And it's not at all what they're saying. They're saying one of their sources was this. But Mark Goodacre certainly thinks there are other sources.
They make a great deal of the fact that the whole idea of the criteria of authenticity has been questioned quite a bit by the most recent generations of scholars, and therefore say that without something like the criteria of authenticity, you can't make any kind of judgment as to what is possibly historical and what isn't. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think it's completely wrong. And I think that the reason I think it's wrong is because it's partly the fault of New Testament scholars, frankly. Because what New Testament scholars did inadvertently is they came up with these criteria and they named them and they defined them very narrowly. And so you have your criterion of dissimilarity, criterion of multiple attestation, criterion of cohesion, and you have these criteria. And New Testament scholars generally are not trained as historians. And they don't know how history is done normally. If they did know how history is done normally, they would realize that the criteria that they're putting out there as these defined things are simply how historians do history. It's just how it's done. You don't need to name these things criterion of dissimilarity, because what happens, it's kind of like a court case. You're prosecuting a court case. You're in court. You're prosecuting somebody who's accused of a crime. How do you figure out if the person did the crime? Well, you try to get multiple sources that agree that they haven't collaborated with one another, right? They corroborate, but they don't collaborate. Well, you look for that, and that's good if you get it. If you have eyewitnesses, man, that's really good. If you've got somebody on the witness stand, suppose the prosecuted person has an alibi, and the person on the witness stand is his mother, who's desperate to get him off the hook. But under questioning, she actually destroys his alibi. That's not what she wanted to do, but she did it. And so you know that she's probably telling the truth here, right? If she's lying, it'd be the other way. That's the criterion of dissimilarity. And historians use these things all the time. They just don't call them these things.
No, and the criterion of embarrassment is more of a rule of thumb than anything else. But I was reading quite recently about the Roman general Stilicho in the 5th century, and a panegyrist, a poem of praise, was making excuses for why he retreated in the face of a Gothic army. Yeah. Now, I think that indicates that he probably did retreat in the face of a Gothic army.
Exactly. And you get stuff like that in the Gospels about Jesus, where they're trying to explain something and you think, probably somebody didn't make that one up.
Okay. Look, I think what we could probably say in relation to that one then, that obviously we can't prove that there are independent sources, but you would argue fairly strongly that on the whole, the balance of the evidence indicates that there probably is, even though there are probably some bits that the gospel writers, shall we say, made up, so invented for rhetorical reasons.
I think they certainly made things up, but they certainly had sources. And you can't prove it. I mean, you can't prove history. It's not like chemistry where you can keep doing the experiment. You show probabilities and you look at evidence, but you've got to have evidence. So if you claim that somebody made it all up, okay, what's your evidence?
Sure. Okay. Let's talk about James, the brother of the Lord. And I'm paraphrasing, but I seem to remember you once said if Jesus didn't exist, then that'd be strange that his brother James didn't know about it.
Yeah, I think that was a rather clever line of mine, actually. I still use it, yeah.
I laughed when I read it. This passage in Galatians, so Galatians 1:19, where Paul is saying that he's insisting, I didn't meet with any of those guys. I didn't get my teaching from any of those guys. When I went to Jerusalem, I definitely didn't meet with any of those guys. And then says, except for Cephas, Peter, and James, the brother of the Lord.
Not quite. What he says is, I met only with Cephas. The only apostle I met with was Cephas. And then he says, except James, the brother of the Lord.
Right. Gotcha.
Didn't meet with any of the other apostles except James, the brother of the Lord. Yeah.
Okay, so the argument that we can make about that is that Paul is basically saying he met with Jesus' brother. It's a bit difficult to meet with the brother of someone that didn't exist, or with the brother of someone that was a purely celestial being. The mythicist argument is that Paul believed in Jesus as a purely celestial being, so this pretty much scuppers that if we accept that James was Jesus' brother. So they have to go through various hoops to try and explain this away, and to make it clear, apparently, that he wasn't saying that James was Jesus' brother. The way they normally do that is by saying that Paul often refers to other Christians as brothers and sisters, brother in Christ, or just brother. So they claim what he's saying is that he met with James, but this James wasn't a brother of Jesus as in a sibling. He was simply a believer.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
I think it's completely wrong. I think it can be shown to be wrong just from this passage or from other things. So what he calls James the brother of the Lord, and people like Richard Carrier and others say that he means that he's a Christian. So I met with, and elsewhere, Paul in 1 Corinthians says that he has the right to go around with a wife like Cephas does, and the brothers of the Lord. So those are the two places he uses that phrase, brother of the Lord. Just those are the only two passages. He uses brothers a lot. He never calls Christians brothers of the Lord.
Yep.
And so Richard Carrier and others have to kind of go around to try and figure out how he really means brothers of the Lord, even though he never says brothers of the Lord. It's just these two passages. But it doesn't make sense that it means Christians. Because why would he say Cephas can take his wife with him, and so can the brothers of the Lord, if he means Christians?
Yeah.
If it just means that they're Christians, and so he clearly doesn't just mean Christian when he says the term brother of the Lord. And in Galatians 1:19, I mean, this is so clear that he's talking about the brother of Jesus that I think most people who look at this, who can actually read it in the Greek and stuff, just kind of scratch their heads about why are they saying this isn't Jesus' brother, his biological brother. And Richard Carrier says, well, it doesn't call him biological brother. Well, okay. How many ancient texts identify a brother by saying the word biological brother? But it's clear. I mean, I can talk a long time about Galatians 1:19 if you want to, if it's a really crucial point. Because
it kind of is. I mean, there's a whole lot of points. We could talk about Romans 1:3, where he says, he was born a descendant of David, and there's a whole convoluted mythicist.
Galatians 4:4, Galatians 4:4 in the same book, he says he was born of a woman.
Yeah. Oh, they say that's allegorical. Yeah. Well, they say that's allegorical because later on he mentions Hagar and Sarah. We could talk for days about this, but let's focus on Galatians 1:19.
Yeah.
I think this one is quite interesting. So effectively, what you're saying and what you're pointing out is the mainstream view that clearly, from the context, this brother of the Lord or these brothers of the Lord have to be a subset of Christian believers who are distinct in some way from others. Otherwise, as you say, why would he say Cephas and James, the brother of the Lord? Why would he say Cephas, brothers of the Lord, or the other apostles? So it has to be a subset. So the question is, what is this subset? My argument is, and always has been, we have evidence for a subset that fits the bill, the brothers of the Lord, the siblings of Jesus.
Yeah.
One of whom is called James, who is referred to in multiple sources, including a non-Christian source, if you accept the James reference in Josephus, which most scholars do.
Yes.
So it seems pretty clear to me that it means siblings.
Yeah.
Because there's actual evidence. They argue, no, it's another subset. It's a sub-apostolic group of believers, so they're separate from people like Peter and the other apostles, but they're another subgroup, even though there isn't actually any actual attestation of that subgroup. So I would say Occam's razor says brothers of the Lord means siblings, because we actually have evidence, not supposition.
Well,
would you say the same?
Well, yeah, you shouldn't prefer the explanation that has no evidence. And so we have the brothers of the Lord are mentioned in Mark chapter 6. The four of them are named, and they're mentioned in John chapter 7. So so we certainly have that. So I completely agree with you on that. But even without that, when you just read Galatians 1:19, it's not talking about some Christian who's in, by the way, we don't have any reference to some other group, the brothers of the Lord. So that just doesn't work, I think. But Richard Carrier. I mean, I think when you wrote me, you mentioned some of his arguments, and I'd be happy to talk about his arguments because I think they're really quite problematic. I mean,
okay. Well, let me. He gets quite agitated if you talk about his arguments and his.
I noticed that.
He gets very agitated about that. So let's not agitate Richard. Let's bring up from his book on the historicity of Jesus.
Yeah.
I'll just bring up this passage. So this is from pages 588 to 89. He talks about the grammar of Galatians 1:19. He says, "Why didn't Paul just say, 'Of them that were apostles before me, I met none except Peter and James'? Why does he construct a convoluted sentence? 'I consulted with Peter, but another of the apostles I did not see except James'?" Mm-hmm. So he then refers to this article by Paul Trudinger. He says, who says this would certainly be an odd way for Paul to say he saw only two apostles, Peter and James. To say that, a far simpler sentence would do. So why the complex sentence instead? Paul could perhaps mean that he consulted with Peter and only saw James, so idio, but that is, he didn't discuss anything with James. But if that were his point, why would he would make sure to emphasize it, since it would be essential to his argument, yet he doesn't. In fact, he is saying that he saw none of the other apostles. That would entail he was claiming he did not consult with any either. I can see a number of problems with this passage, but I'll be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about it. One is this construction that he's calling to be very strange. Actually, Paul does in other places too, where he'll say, not this, except that. And with exactly the same wording that is being isolated as being so very strange. And I can give you one example that's pretty clear. I mean, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 14, Paul says that I am thankful that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. And it's the same thing. It's the same Greek, may, except. And so what he's doing is it's like he says something, well, yeah, except for these two. And that's what he's doing here. I didn't meet any of the apostles except for I met only Peter, but none of the apostles except James.
Yeah, which kind of makes sense. I mean, it does seem to be like he's writing and then thinking, oh, well, hang on, I did meet with Peter and actually I did meet with James. It seems to be, it's almost stream of consciousness.
It is, and it's the brother of the Lord is irrelevant to that. It's the brother of the Lord.
Yeah, but Trudinger says he makes the argument that what the way we should be reading this is that James wasn't an apostle.
That's
what do you make
right.
of that?
Well, I don't agree with it, but it is a minority view in scholarship.
Sure.
It was argued by Richard Balcom after that, and it was and when people sometimes mythicists point to the NIV translation, the International Version translation of this, to support their view, which the NIV says something like, I didn't meet with any of the other apostles, only with James, the brother of the Lord. And so they say, so he's saying that this brother was not an apostle.
Yeah.
And they take this as support for their view that this wasn't the brother of the Lord. And so I kind of wonder about that NIV translation, the way of putting it that way. I didn't meet with any of the apostles. I didn't meet with any of the apostles. I only met with James. Okay. And I always thought that's kind of a weird thing in the NIV. And I wondered, do the translators think that James was not the brother of the Lord? And, actually, the answer is they all think James is the brother of the Lord. Every one of those translators. And if anyone doesn't believe me, you can find their names online. Just write them and ask them.
It's awesome.
and I was actually curious about this whole thing. And I decided, so the person who's the chair of the NIV committee is Simon Gathercole. He's a professor of New Testament, senior professor in Cambridge in the UK. And so I wrote him. I said, what is it with this translation of this? Why did you put it that way? Because it's not what it means. It means except James. I didn't mean any of the apostles except. Why is it translated other than? He said, yeah. I said, that was in the version came out in 2011. And he said, yeah, people are misusing that to think that somehow James is not the brother of Jesus. None of us thinks that. It's that they're trying to say that Paul their view, the view is this, that Paul had a strict definition of the apostles, that it's either one of the 12 or him. And in their view, then he can't call James, the brother of the Lord, an apostle, because he's not one of the 12.
Mm.
And so it's not that James isn't the brother of the Lord, it's that he's not in this view, which is a very minority view that apparently the committee doesn't agree with anymore, is that it's like that's even not the right translation.
Sure. And like even if Trüdiger is right, and what he's saying is that he's excluding Paul from the category, James from the category of apostle.
Yeah.
I still don't see how that's a problem. Because first of all, the word apostle in this period, as far as I can make out, simply means an emissary, a messenger. And there were some people who were regarded as being, it was a category of believers. Maybe James wasn't regarded as one of those types of people. Maybe just hung around in Jerusalem.
No, that's what Trüdiger and Balcom and the NIV committee in 2010 were thinking. It's not that he wasn't the brother of the Lord. They all think he was the brother of the Lord. So the question is whether he gets that title or not.
Okay, let me just pull up another passage from Carrier, but you've possibly already counted this, but this is another passage from his book. Just bear with me. There we go. So this is from page 590. So again, he's insisting that the Greek is very strange. Yeah. Unless Paul actually meant other than the apostles, I saw only James, meaning quite specifically that this James was not an apostle. So it's the point we were just talking about. Doesn't really matter. Ordinarily, to say you saw no other apostle, you would write heteron ton apostlon hook, or I won't inflict my Greek pronunciation on you, or other things similar. But here Paul instead chose the unusual and for Paul unprecedented construction, heteron ton apostolon, without oudeus, or without the word heteron means the genitive. In this fashion, it often means other than, rather than another of. Paul would simply be classifying a meeting with Cephas as a meeting with the apostles, as anticipated in 117, and then making sure he named all the Christians he met on that occasion, so Cephas and James, in anticipation of his claim that no one in Judea had ever seen him, as mentioned in 122. The latter claim would be a lie if he met any Christian, if he had met any Christian, even one who was not an apostle during his visit to Cephas. So Paul has to name all the Christians he met on that occasion, and lying or not, the number needed to be low for his argument to hold. Accordingly, Paul says there was only one other brother James, and their brother meaning believer. Deep breath. Does this help him?
Well, it's really one of the problems I have with arguing with a number of Mythicists is that they develop these long arguments that take a long time to take apart. But once you take them apart, they don't make any sense. And so I'll just tell you for this one, because I was curious about this. I thought, well, that's really interesting. I mean, it's a little bit unusual to use the kind of phrasing that that Paul uses here, but it's not Greek. It's just, these words are not that common. Heteron's not that common. But when Richard says that the way you would write it is heteron ton apostolon uk, that first bit of Greek that he has there, and then he says, look at these two passages and you think he means that's where Paul uses that kind of construction. That passage doesn't have this construction. Paul never writes those words like that. And then when he says, or udina heteron ton apostolon, as Paul usually does, and he quotes 3 verses. Look at those verses. Those words do not occur in those 3 verses.
I'm sorry to admit I didn't look up those verses. I should have done that.
The second one, the word heteron doesn't even occur in 1 Corinthians 1:14, 2:8, or 9:15. And in Romans 7:23, 13:9, there's no negative at all. So why is he saying that he would normally put the negative after the apostolon? There's no negative in that sentence. And so so the problem is he's saying these things. And, most people reading this don't know Greek. They wouldn't be able to look it up. And it sounds, wow, Paul would have written this, but he wrote this other thing. And but no, it's like, so, the thing is that when Paul uses the word heteron, I looked it up because I was interested in this. Paul uses the word heteron 27 times. And he never uses it in the way that this passage says he uses it, where Richard says that he would do it like this because that's how he normally does it. He never uses it in the way that he says he normally would do it. So
I learned many years ago that you need to check Richard Carrier's references and footnotes very carefully. I've got a well-thumbed copy of his book, and I learned a long time ago that when Richard Carrier says something is the case, the more emphatically he says it, the more you need to check. So I probably should have looked those up. That's very interesting. Okay.
But he says things like that. This passage that you just quoted there comes after where people have to be critical, and they have to be critical thinkers. They can't just accept what people say to them, and then he gives things like this, and this is after basically saying that New Testament scholars who've worked on these passages for decades, individually worked on them for decades, don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And then he starts giving quotations that have no relevance to what his argument is. So what? It's very frustrating. Very frustrating.
There's going to be a blog post in response.
Oh
to this
God,
video.
there's going to be a book. I mean, it's just like it's endless, and it's just. But I'm just, So yeah.
Yeah. I'm much the same. I suppose on that last point about you can't trust what all these New Testament people are saying. Do you realize he's written a new book which didn't pass peer review, which he's very angry about, where he proves that Gnosticism didn't exist? I was listening to your podcast this morning about Gnosticism, but Richard Carrier has debunked it. So
you mean
you're wasted.
There's no such thing as Gnostics?
No such thing. Yeah. No, there were no Gnostics.
Okay.
I just thought let's put that out there.
There's no such thing as Jews either, apparently, or maybe there's no such things as Romans. I don't know. What makes you think there are Romans?
Yeah. Well, anyway, Richard Carrier strikes again. So there's a couple of other questions.
There are plenty of people who think that Gnosticism is too broad of a term, and that you can't, that it's like it's too broad to cover. I mean, but wow, okay.
We're going to have to wait until the book comes out, or not. A couple of other questions that people ask me to raise with you. I mean, one comes up quite often. It came up in one of my comments on one of my videos. They say mythicists like Carrier and his friend Latasta have published peer-reviewed books detailing their case. Why won't historicists, so-called, like you, do the same? Why won't you publish a peer-reviewed book responding in detail to all of the mythicists' peer-reviewed arguments? Isn't that how scholarship works?
So I have to say, so I've been, I started getting deeply into scholarship probably 45 years ago or so, and I spend almost every day reading scholarship. And so I never hear scholars talk about that they've consulted an article that was peer reviewed, or that I have a peer reviewed book. So I'm not quite sure why. It's only the mythicists I hear do that. I'm not quite sure what it means. I mean, why do they? Like this article you're just talking about on Galatians 1:19. It was published in 1975, 50 years ago. And the one article that Richard says supports his view, and no other, he apparently couldn't find other articles, but he did insist this is peer reviewed. And I'm wondering what he thinks that means, because I mean, I know what it means, but why does he keep saying that? Because when I write a scholarly book, I published a book a couple years ago with Yale University Press about journeys to the afterlife that are narrated in Greek, Roman, Jewish, and Christian traditions. And I talk a lot, I mention a lot of scholarship in there. And all the scholarship I mention is peer reviewed. But I never would say this article is peer reviewed. Of course it's peer reviewed. So I don't understand why. I don't understand what that is. Maybe
it seems to be a kind of a magical talisman for them, because he got that on the Historicity of Jesus book peer reviewed, and so that magically makes it into like authoritative. And of course, you and I both know that's not how peer review works.
No, it's not. But if he thinks that a peer reviewed thing is authoritative, then what does he do with the fact that almost all the peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and books about Galatians disagree with him on virtually everything he says about it?
Yeah, except for and bets maybe, but yeah.
No, Betts doesn't agree with him.
True, yeah.
He says he does, but he doesn't. He doesn't think. Hans Dieter Betts, of course, he thought that Jesus' brother was James was Jesus' brother.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm just wondering about the peer review thing. I just don't. So why don't scholars write peer reviewed books arguing that Jesus existed?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. It's like, I know. I mean, look, I don't want to sound offensive to anybody because I think every hypothesis has to be considered. When you're doing history, everything has to be considered as a possibility. But there are some things that experts agree on so widely that they don't write books on people who argue something else. I mean, for example, there are thousands of professional astronomers in the country. No, I won't do astronomers. I'll do geologists. Thousands of geologists in the country, and none of them is going to spend his time or her time writing a long peer-reviewed book to prove that the Earth is not 6,000 years old, that it's older than 6,000 years. Because there are people who say that on the internet, who say that the Earth is really only 6,000 years old. But you're not going to have an astronomer take his time to write a peer-reviewed book to prove it's not, because everybody knows it's not, who's an expert in the field.
Yeah.
So with New Testament scholars, I wrote a book. I mean, as they all know, I wrote a book on did Jesus exist? And I guess what they're saying is that it wasn't peer reviewed, but I can because it was published by a trade press. So that's true. I mean, they didn't send it out to peers, but it's absolutely true. Why don't I publish one with Oxford University Press? They probably wouldn't publish it because it's like, what scholars am I informing here?
Yeah, it's not a live debate. Whenever I make the same argument that you just made, I always say, well, for the same reason that people don't write peer review books on why the Earth is actually not the center of the universe, even though there is actually there's been a couple of PhD crackpots, but they've got PhDs and they've published stuff in peer review that they claim supports the idea of geocentrism. It's not a live debate. There isn't a real debate there. Now, whenever I make that argument, people say, well, you're comparing something that's absolutely solid, like geocentrism being wrong, to something that's not as solid, Jesus existing. But how would you respond to that? I know my response. How would you respond?
Well, I would say that that science, natural sciences, or hard sciences, however you want to call them, are different from history. But there are some fields of inquiry that have different methods of establishing what they consider to be valid and true. And history simply can't do things that astronomers can do to show that the entire universe is not circling around us. They can prove that scientifically. You can't prove history that way. You have other ways of establishing history. It doesn't mean that that it's all up for grabs. There are very clear guidelines for how you establish what happened in the past, but it's not scientific.
Sure. And that's pretty much what I say. I also say that the analogy isn't between the degree of certitude, the analogy is between the degree of consensus. Mm-hmm. They're not quite the same thing. Bit subtle for some. But okay, so that's why you're not publishing peer-reviewed stuff arguing against mythicists. It's not a live issue. But
look, it would take 2 years of my life to do it, and I've got other things I want to write about.
I don't doubt. You're busy people, but they also try to claim that there are the reason there aren't more openly mythicist scholars is that they're afraid it would end their careers, and that many are secretly mythicists, but they're afraid to speak out because of the iron grip that Christianity has on the field. And apparently they speak off the record to Richard Carrier all the time, but he can't reveal who they are. So are you aware of this ghost army of secret mythicists?
Yeah, no. So look, I'm an atheist. And you could claim that, atheists would be afraid to declare themselves atheists if they're teaching Christianity, but no. And so I have no, I have no personal stake. It's not like I'm a believer and my faith would be destroyed if there was no Jesus. It's not like that. And so, no, I don't know of people. I know that they keep claiming that their numbers are growing. I don't personally know of the hundreds and probably thousands of New Testament scholars I know. I personally don't know anyone who's a mythicist, but maybe they do exist. And sometimes they throw out names of people who actually aren't. but so no, I don't. But it's not because of fear. Look, I'll tell you this. I mean, I'm retiring. I'm retiring after this semester, and if I really wanted to make a lot of money, what I would do is become a mythicist. I actually have two paths. I could either become a mythicist or I could become a born-again Christian, and man, I would make a ton. So it's it doesn't work like that.
They do try to claim that there have been people who've come out as mythicists and their careers suffered, but Thomas Brodie and Thomas Thompson, I think, are the two they usually mention.
Really? I don't know what Brodie's situation. I had the impression that Thompson just kind of retired when he was retired.
I'm not really making this argument. I'm just telling you what they say. So,
I don't know if it's true or not. So,
there's a couple of questions that have come to me from my subscribers, and one of them, I interviewed Tom Schmidt about his new book on Josephus, which I started to read thinking I'm not going to be convinced by this at all, and got to the end of and thought, actually, that's a pretty good book. I'm still not convinced, but I still think it was an interesting contribution to the question. Have you read Tom's book? And if so, what do you think of it?
I've not read it. I've looked at it. And I did a conference a few weeks ago for lay people, like scholars doing lay people, and I had him be one of the speakers for that. He spoke about it there, and so I know what his views are. I have not read the detailed argumentation, and like you, it's going to take a lot to convince me that Josephus wrote that Jesus got raised from the dead to fulfill the scriptures. I mean, I think, man, there's no way. So, but the thing is, as a historian, I think every hypothesis has to be entertained, and so you look at the evidence. And
the argument that he makes is that it can be, and this is one of the things I like about it. He's not dogmatic. He says, well, it could be negative, or it could be positive, or it could be neutral. And here are ways that all three of those can be supported. Now, with that part of his book, I probably found the least convincing. The bit that I found most interesting, the two bits I found most interesting, one was on the Greek reception of the early reception of the testimonium, where he says, actually, if it was written to bolster Christian claims, it's funny it wasn't read that way early on. And that was quite an interesting set of arguments. Now, I know that I've come across some counters to his arguments on that. But the other bit that I found very interesting was his chapter on who Josephus knew and tracing Josephus's social contacts and links back to who would have been in Jerusalem around 33 AD and who probably would have been involved in the events if Jesus was arrested by the Romans and crucified, including some people that that Josephus was very, very close to. And that chapter was really interesting because that's an argument I've been making for a while, but I hadn't actually sat down and traced all the links, and he does. And it really shows that Josephus probably knew people who would have been able to tell him, this guy was crucified. He was claimed to be the Messiah. He's got that brother James who lives over there.
Well, it would take a lot to convince me because I don't think the crucifixion of Jesus was a big deal in Jerusalem in 33. I think that, two other guys got crucified that morning, probably half a dozen the next day. I mean, it's just it's not as if this is, if you watch a TV movie where you've got the crowds out there crying, his blood be upon us and our children. That would be a big deal. If somebody was there at the time, they'd notice that. But I think that there was a private trial. Probably think the trial took 20 seconds, and they put him on a cross like they put the other. So I don't think it was public information.
Sure, but the people that Tom Schmidt is talking about are not sort of your average citizens. These are members of the Sanhedrin and members of the priesthood.
But I don't think there was a trial before the Sanhedrin.
I agree. I don't think there was, but they probably would have been, if it happened, they would have been aware that this was going on. So maybe not a big deal, but enough to be noticed by
Maybe
people who were paying attention to what the Romans were doing in their city at Passover.
But well, I'm happy to be convinced. That's my attitude toward most things.
Yeah, I can recommend the book. As I said, look, the thing I liked about it was that it was a very open-minded book.
Yeah.
And the mythicist response to it is typically closed-minded. It basically says, can't be right, he's an idiot, there's only one way to read the testimonium, and that's that it's fake, which I find incredibly dogmatic. Yeah,
and problematic. There are huge problems with that. So
that's true.
Yeah.
Couple of other questions. That last one was from Henri Morantz about Tom Smith's book. From Pat Mulcahy, how do we promote a better understanding of historiography to promote the spread of revisionist thinking such as mythicism?
To prevent the spread or to promote the spread?
Sorry, to prevent, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, yes.
Well, there are a lot of, mythicism has to do with the historical Jesus, and there are a lot of very fine scholars who deal with the historical Jesus and talk about the sources of information and how we can use them. People of all sorts. I'm an atheist. There are Roman Catholic scholars who've done it very fine. John Meyer has this multi-volume work on the historical Jesus, the first very thick volume, which deals with sources and how to deal with them. And so there's a lot of, the way to do it is to read widely. The problem, I think, my sense is that many people who are attracted to a mythicist position have not read widely in the field and don't really know basic information about the Bible. I've done conferences where there have been, I've done public events in mythicist circles, and I'm sometimes surprised by that there isn't a lot of knowledge, just basic knowledge about the sources and how one uses them, and kind of generally. But they've heard a mythicist line and it sounds convincing, and so they follow it. So I just say a lot more reading, really.
No, good answer. And once upon a time, Bart, I foolishly used to spend part of my day debating mythicists on various forums, and I gave up. My girlfriend said to me, "Why do you do this?" And after about 6 or 7 years, I said, "You know what? I don't know." Also, it was the same arguments over and over again. I don't bother anymore. Yeah. But your point about, I often point out to people that there's an inverse relationship between how convincing mythicism seems and how much you actually know about the sources and their contexts. And I often say to people, why is it that the people who are most qualified to assess mythicism are not convinced by it, and the people who are most likely to be convinced by it are the people who are not qualified to assess it? Doesn't that ring a warning bell for you? And I don't know if that argument actually works, but I think it makes some sense. Well,
I think it makes sense, and I think it does not work, because then the response is, well, you're just being an elitist.
Yeah.
And we're living in an age when expertise doesn't matter anymore, and facts don't matter, and truth doesn't matter, and evidence doesn't matter. So if it doesn't matter, just believe whatever you want, whatever sounds interesting.
Yep, you're right. Final question from my subscriber, Stephen Wynn asked, he said, has anyone made a mythicist argument trying to deny the existence of Paul? Besides his own letters, is there any other evidence that Paul was a historical person?
So I don't know. I'm sure I think, I don't know about mythicists saying that Paul didn't exist. Possibly some of them do. Some certainly say he didn't write this or that letter, or he didn't write any letters. There's a recent book arguing he didn't write the letters that we have. Yeah. And so there's that kind of thing. I don't think there are any books proving that Paul existed. We do have, in terms of evidence, we certainly have a number of letters that can easily be situated in a situation that makes sense in the 50s of the Common Era or the 60s of the Common Era. We have later authors toward the end of the first century who claimed to be Paul, which means that he was somebody they knew about. We have the Book of Acts, which gives narratives about Paul, many of which are not trustworthy, but it's certainly assuming that he existed. Outside of the New Testament, we have a book by called First Clement, which is highly dependent on First Corinthians, and it's written to the church in Corinth by somebody in Rome in 95, which mentions the death of Paul. We have writers such as Ignatius in the early 2nd century who quote letters of Paul, who know Paul's letters to the Ephesians, and Polycarp, who knows letters to the Philippians. And so we have we have pretty solid evidence. And it's like, if you want to claim Paul didn't exist, that'd be a tall hill to climb.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is they often do climb some tall hills.
Yes,
You might have noticed. Actually, I like to collect really wacky mythicism, and there's some examples. There's one guy who has spent years writing about how the whole of Christianity was invented by Constantine and Eusebius in the 4th century, and everything else was before that was forged. Yeah. And he's got reams and reams and reams of argument and evidence.
People, and that's it. That Christianity is invented by Roman emperors, has been around for a while.
Is that one?
And it's just, the thing is, but as you were saying before, these are not people. The people who write these things are not trained in these fields, and they don't really know much about Roman history. And all you need to do is read a lot of Roman history from the ancient world, even. This just does not work. But if you don't know anything, then it sounds, well, that's cool. I think I'll believe that. Okay. You want to?
So I often get people saying that you can dismiss Josephus because he doesn't actually footnote his sources, and therefore we just dismiss it. And I say, well, okay, so we just dismiss him on Jesus or everything? Do we dismiss Tacitus and Suetonius and because they don't footnote their sources?
Why not? No footnotes. Right.
Apply that to the things you don't like, and they tie themselves in all kinds of knots to try and explain this stuff away. It is fun, but sometimes it gets quite maddening. But we are pretty much out of time, and I do really appreciate you taking the time to have a chat. As I said at the beginning, I'm a big fan. I've been reading your stuff for a long time. And whenever anyone asks me what's one book to read if you want to understand or get a beginning of an understanding on the historical Jesus, I always recommend your Jesus Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, which I remember reading when it first came out and thought, well, yeah, that's exactly what I've been working out for the last 15, 20 years. So that's a great little book. Highly recommend.
Thank you. I'm glad. Yeah.
So, look, thank you again for coming on.
Yes,
History for
my
Atheists.
pleasure. This has been fun. Yeah.
And you are potentially the final guest, since I'm kind of wrapping the project up a little bit. So I think we went out with a bit of a bang. I know it's going to have an impact. I can hear Richard Carrier writing the angry blog post even as we speak. So, Bart, thank you again, and enjoy your retirement.
Okay, well, enjoy your finishing this, because it's it's a good thing you've been doing.
Thanks very much, Bart. All the best. Bye bye.
All right, bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my discussion of Jesus Mythicism with Bart Ehrman. I'd like to thank the generous contributors who made this interview possible by helping me to cover Bart's speaking fee. So special thanks to Andy Bannister, Chris Bauer, Thomas Dalby, Ben Haliski, Philippe Antoine Hayek, Rickard Carlson, Chris McBride, S.C. Melville, Henri Morant, Wilbur Nelson, Clifford Plumpton, Guillermo Romero, Reese Smith, Sean Storer, Nectarius Themelis, Carl Utionen, and very special thanks to the particularly generous donations from Patrick Mulcahy and Steve Wynn. Also, thanks to all of you who have watched these History for Atheists videos or listened to the podcast audio editions. We've had some great guests over the last 5 years, and I've enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to some brilliant scholars and discuss a range of ideas. Many thanks also to all my guests over those years. As I mentioned in my introduction, this is not quite the end for History for Atheists, though it is likely the end for this channel, at least in its current format. So thanks again, keep an eye out for announcements of my future projects, and keep reading history books. Goodbye.